Episode 6, Swords into Plowshares.
I'm rising up with a full heart. I'm taking my strength from inside. I'm rising up with a new mind. I'm taking your words and let you all behind. I'm coming up from underneath the rain.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Today, I will be discussing a few passages from Scripture that describe not learning war and beating swords into plowshares. But before we begin, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button on whatever podcatcher you're using so not to miss any future episodes. And if you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. And speaking of iTunes, we had another 5-star rating and review since the last recording. Mark, the Theist Libertarian, wrote, "I found this show very informative and thought-provoking. I plan to incorporate some of the breakdown of 1 Samuel 8 as I try to keep theocracy out of Arkansas. Doesn't that sound strange for a pastor to say? If my gospel is good and powerful, as I believe it to be, there is no reason to use force of the state to impose it on others. Keep doing a good job." Mark, it's encouraging that the work I'm doing here can assist you in spreading the gospel in Arkansas. Being from the South as well, I know exactly what you're saying about theocracy and the acceptance of state force that it breeds in the minds of Christians. I really appreciate your review and thanks for taking the time to write it. And if anyone else is enjoying the podcast, let me know as well as others by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes or wherever you catch the episodes. It will help us reach more listeners and grow the show. Also, since the last recording, we received 2 more patrons through Patreon. John and Cheowin both made monthly pledges to the show. Guys, I am blown away by your support, and I will keep working to bring you the content you want to hear. I appreciate it, and I really can't thank you enough. If anyone else is interested in supporting us with a one-time or monthly donation through Patreon, visit the support tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to our Patreon page, where you will find a few ways to support us, from a one-time donation of any amount or a few monthly levels from $2 a month to the executive producer level. When you check out the page, you'll see some of the perks that's associated with each of those levels. So if you like what we're doing, hit the link and check out the options for support. And again, thank you, John and Cheowin, for your financial support. And one last thing before we get started on today's show. I'm very excited to announce that my family and I will be traveling to PorcFest this year. The 15th annual Porcupine Freedom Festival is put on by the Free State Project in the Live Free or Die state of New Hampshire. This will be our first time attending the PorcFest and visiting New Hampshire. I'm looking forward to meeting anyone who will also be there, and who knows, maybe scout out some real estate in the freest state of the union while I'm up there. So in a few months, I will be in Lancaster, New Hampshire, and I'll update you on my itinerary when I get it locked in, and I hope to see you there. All right. Are you familiar with the biblical phrase, swords into plowshares? It's a powerful term. It's been depicted in a bronze statue and is the name of a museum in Ontario. As the phrase suggests, the statue depicts a man hammering a sword, a weapon of war, into a plowshare, a beneficial tool for preparing the ground for seeds to grow food. And the museum houses just that, displaying literal objects of war transformed into useful items, such as a ram tank converted into a snowplow. Where it might be more familiar, though, is the title of the book written by Ron Paul. Swords into Plowshares is an excellent book on peace and warfare. It drives home the state's inclination towards war and the waste and abuse of life and liberty that inevitably comes from war. I strongly recommend this book to anyone listening, as well as I think it should be a strong recommendation for anyone looking to join the military, especially during this time of perpetual interventionist war. It's accurately subtitled A Life in Wartime and a Future of Peace and Prosperity. Dr. Paul gives us personal insight from his youth, his military service, and his political experience, as well as his formulas for changing our current interventionist course. As the book bearing the title might suggest, he also directs many of his questions and criticisms to professing Christians in America. He even goes as far to claim that, quote, individuals who give enthusiastic support for the use of force to solve all the problems of the world have faith in violence. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. Now, as our faith requires, and if we're to live up to the rhetoric of calling ourselves a Christian nation, our foreign policy should reflect biblical principles. They shall beat their swords into plowshares is just that biblical standard we should fall back to. Its anti-war message rings loudly, and this is why Dr. Paul singled this verse out, and an artist made it a monument. So, where do we find this verse? As I mentioned in the episodes before, we do not want to be guilty of proof texting these few words, taking them out of context, and using them to drive a narrative contrary to their intended purpose. In this case specifically, we can be accused of doing it because of the overwhelming anti-war message from these verses and the overwhelming pro-war message from the church today. All right, the first occurrence for the phrase, swords into plowshares, is from Isaiah chapter 2. Isaiah is a major prophet, and the first few chapters lay out the prophecy of the rebellion and redemption of God's people. The action of turning the swords into plowshares is represented in chapter 2, verse 4, as a result of walking in the light of the Lord, and results in people not learning war anymore. Chapter 2, verse 1 through 5, reads as follows. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall decide disputes for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. I've seen this verse and those that hold to this interpretation scoffed at when referenced as a way Christians should be acting now. The charge against it and peaceful Christians is that the action of not learning war or beating weapons of war into tools of agriculture are to happen only as a result of being in a peaceful time. But that isn't what Isaiah lays out. It is a result of God's people following him. And to further the wrongful interpretation, it's usually the mindset of those opposed to acting peaceful now that believe war brings peace. They won't use this language, but what they are saying is that only after we've killed all those that oppose us can we have peace. Then we can beat our swords into plowshares. Does that sound Christ-like? Unfortunately, the mindset of peaceful interactions now isn't really recognized by the majority of Christians. To not learn war anymore may not be as symbolically rich a phrase as beating of swords into plowshares, but it is strong in its implications of how we fill our time outside of walking in the light of the Lord. The time it takes to learn war is overwhelming. As a Christian, we know our time is to be spent praising God, helping the needy, spreading the gospel to the lost, and loving our enemies. I find it very difficult to find the time to cram learning war into my day with all the other duties I just mentioned. To further emphasize my point, a particular quote from our Secretary of Defense, Marine General James Mad Dog Mattis, was brought to my attention from fellow Christians. Unfortunately, they were extremely excited by his appointment to that position and shared this quote as a moment of unmeasurable pride in the direction of our foreign policy and, to be honest, a standard of manliness. Mad Dog says, "Be polite, be professional, but have a plan to kill everybody you meet." Yes, this is the guy that your Christian friends and family are excited about. Does that sound Christ-like? If this is a Christian nation, don't we want our leaders to sound Christ-like? It sounds reminiscent to Theodore Roosevelt saying, "Speak softly and carry a big stick" as well. To be honest, though, there was a time that I would have gotten amped about these remarks too, and I am ashamedly a repentant neocon that made every excuse in the book. But we, professed Christians, need to take an honest look at these remarks and ask ourselves, would Jesus say that? Would he tell his disciples to do that? And we can't find these moments in the Bible. Having a plan to kill everyone you meet sounds very much like learning war. And so I question again, not only do we not see Christ saying anything like this, where do we find the time to make such plans while we're praying for, loving, and forgiving our enemies? The fact is, to learn war is very intensive. The military calls it basic training. And I'm not sure if they still do bayonet training, but a crucial moment to a private's experience and a prime example of learning war has always been to call back to the drill sergeant's questions as he stabs the figure of another person, a figure of the image of God. What is the spirit of the bayonet, the drill calls? To kill, kill, kill without regret, the private responds. What makes the green grass grow? Asked the drill again. Blood, blood, bright red blood, again responds the private. This is learning war. This is what many Christians think young men should be conscripted to learn. I challenge anyone to honestly say they think Christ would approve of that. So, getting back to finding the reference verses in the Bible. Identical verbiage to Isaiah 2 shows up again in Micah 4, where Isaiah mentions the idolatry and rejection of God to his people's rebellion. Micah gives some additional detail in the previous chapter. The leaders of God's people are condemned for multiple things, but I feel most notably here is building Zion with bloodshed. Zion is a term that is synonymous with Jerusalem and Israel as a whole. It is typically used in a way to symbolize a fulfillment of God's promises to his people, and so is also applied to a spiritual or heavenly city of Jerusalem. There's a lot of symbolism involved in the promises to the faithful, and it can become very confused today. especially around the turn of the 20th century, where Zionism became a term describing an ideology inconsistent with biblical teaching. That ideology teaches the reestablishment of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. Of course, this has been the source of much bloodshed over there, as the reclaiming of the land and the rebuilding of the temple to actualize Zion is as Micah describes. Coincidentally, a way of interpreting scripture among Christians became popular at the same time and is today known as dispensationalism, as taught by C.I. Scofield and his reference Bible. This teaching has its roots before Scofield, but this was the first time it reached so large an audience and has since corrupted the majority of evangelicalism today. Dispensationalism is the primary vehicle for American approval of Zionism and the bloodshed required to build Zion with men's hands. At this point, I do realize I'm getting into a controversial area. Even among Christians, this is a very touchy subject. Just sharing opinions that are less than unconditionally supportive of the state of Israel opens you up to accusations of anti-Semitism. I risk derailing this entire conversation as well, but I think it is important to completely understand the point. This is why Dr. Paul's book on the subject brings up Zionism and the Israel lobby, and is even why it's defamed by people like Ben Shapiro, regardless of Paul's personal consistency on subjects of policy and people groups. It's easy to agree with everything until it comes to this, and it's from years of indoctrination within the church. It's not enough to say that dispensationalism from Scofield is the dominant theological interpretation. I will make the claim that it is the assumed understanding of the Bible and end-time scripture by nearly every Christian in the country. Be this orchestrated or coincidental, it is absolutely to the benefit of politicians and powerful lobbies. H.L. Mencken once wrote quite accurately, "The whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed, and hence clamorous, to be led to safety, by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. This plays out stateside with our own fears of terrorism, but also with Christians' fears of attacks on Israel from state actors like Iran." Comments that went quickly viral a few years ago between Mike Huckabee, an Israeli minister, and various Jewish councils illustrate the exaggeration that is being pushed on the American people for unquestioned support of Middle East affairs. At first glimpse of diplomacy with Iran in 2015, Huckabee announced that the Iran deal will take the Israelis and march them to the door of the oven. Honestly, this is just insane. I'd wager that Israel has one of the most efficient fighting forces, and Israel would agree with me. The exaggeration and ridiculousness of his remarks were quickly exposed by Israeli political personnel and Jewish groups. I know this seems like I'm getting off topic, but this level of fear, vitriol, and polarization is only capable from a theology that has been ingrained through generations. Being that I believe this is one of the most relevant answers to the questions against Christianity due to the obvious contradiction from the actions of the church and plain readings of Scripture, I will get further into this in later episodes. Okay, getting back on track. The third reference of swords and plowshares is in Joel 3. It's interesting because it's a reverse call to nations, not Christians, to abandon peace and pick up arms against each other as God's judgment against them. Quote, consecrate for war, stir up the mighty men. Let all the men of war draw near. Let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am a warrior. The theme of God's judgment against sinful men through bloody wars is not unusual to the Old Testament and serves as a warning and a reminder for his people in the negative rather than the positive commands for and illustrations of peace. And all too often, Christians look to the stories or promises of wars and rumors of wars that they mistake a warning for a command. After that, it's a domino effect of poor interpretation. The divisiveness of the gospel brought by Christ and illustrated as a sword becomes many Christians' excuse to carry a sword and shed blood as a duty to God. In the book, Swords into Plowshares, Dr. Paul accurately lays out these misconceptions of Matthew 24:6 after he asks, must there always be wars and rumors of wars? He answers, accepting the inevitability of war is one thing, but glorifying war in the name of God and claiming that it reflects strong character and patriotism is quite another. He also offers an answer to a related sentiment felt by non-theist and nationalist Christians alike that are critical of peaceful Christians. He writes, though the Old Testament is filled with violence, there is no evidence Christianity in any way promotes war and violence as a solution to any of our problems. There is also no biblical instruction that we should ignore the goal of peace. Christ never taught us to hate or kill our enemies. Rather, he taught us to love them. We should not assume it is possible to achieve this. Jesus was the Prince of Peace, not the champion of war. I can't recommend Swords into Plowshares enough. And as a wrap up, I'd like to leave you with a few other quotes from the book. One of my favorites. For peace to break out, the prevailing sentiment has to be the rejection of the initiation of force against others. And I think it is important to note for Christians on this topic of peace, we can't see our standard for ourselves differently from our standard for the government, be it politicians, police, or the military. There are some people that are enthusiastic for the violent actions of government at home and abroad. But many also tend to vote away their responsibility, feeling that they never committed any of the violence involved in conscription or nation building, but they're glad that someone is doing it. They think it is necessary to achieve peace. So, as we look at Dr. Paul's comments, it is as much about us, the individual, as it is about the individuals we want representing us. So, one last quote on the matter from Dr. Paul that I feel really lends to an overall rejection of our current war state as a way forward, with that prevailing sentiment he talked about in mind, is this: a policy designed for peace must not allow a compromise on non-aggression in foreign affairs. No initiation of force against a foreign state, regardless of its imperfections or our perceived needs or wants, should be permitted. Neither is it morally justified. A policy of non-aggression and non-intervention means no compromise on preemptive war. It means no sanctions, blockades, cruise missile launches, conventional bombings, CIA intrusions in election and other internal affairs, or aid to factions involved in civil and regional wars. We should stop being the world's largest weapons provider if we truly seek peace through non-intervention. The war profiteers should not be allowed to direct our foreign policy. He goes on to say that we have compromised in these ways for too long, and I completely agree. As I mentioned, even if we recognize these actions are terrible, we still allow government representatives to carry them out, as we have been conditioned that it is necessary for peace. Well, I hope you liked this episode on swords and plowshares. If you did, please like and share on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or iTunes. Leave us ratings, reviews, or think about supporting us through Patreon. I also have our Amazon affiliate link up and running, and if you're interested in grabbing a copy of Swords into Plowshares by Ron Paul, I will have an Amazon link in the show notes. If you use the link, Anarcho-Christian will receive a small commission with no additional charge to you. So, until next time, grace and peace, no king but Christ.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.